Well, first, let me thank all the mothers for giving part of their day, their celebratory day, to spend with St. Francis. I can't think of anyone else. Even your husband probably can't compare to spend the day with. I structured tonight's lecture without a PowerPoint. After thinking about it a lot, I actually want to try to do something where I get you to participate in tonight's discussion, because much of St. Francis, you know, if you go to the books, most of it just really doesn't make sense. You read it, not that maybe that's the wrong way to say it, you read it and you say, well, what's the big deal? It doesn't really come through. St. Francis's message comes through his life and comes through reflection on the many things that happened to him. He was not an educated man, as we're going to see. He wasn't, in fact, most of the stuff that he wrote, he dictated. So I think we all know what Francis is trying to do. We've been studying these many years, and his message is very, very simple, as we're going to see. Well, there's been many messages are very simple. And I'm actually hoping that you'll help me to continue to discover St. Francis, and I can maybe share what I've learned in the past year. In 1986, the Pope called a day of international peace and prayer. He invited the leaders and representatives from not only the major religions of the world, but also tribal religions from South America and Africa, all throughout the world. Guess what was the place, the only place in the world that all these people agreed to meet? Assisi. The memory of this man is so powerful across the world, across various religions, that people somehow, wherever they are, they know something about St. Francis. Well, what do you know about St. Francis? When you think St. Francis, what's some of the things that, one of the things, anything that pops into your mind?
Humility.
Humility, right.
Love for all creatures.
Love for all creatures, right. There's a lot of stories of him with talking to not only birds and animals, but also to plants and trees and rocks. Anything else that you know about St. Francis?
Charity.
Charity. In what way?
He gave a lot of people, homeless people, money.
Well, he didn't have any money to give, but he certainly did help a lot of people, maybe we'd call them homeless, something like that, sure. The central message, all these things are true. There's many, many things that we're going to learn about St. Francis, but the central idea of the mature Francis is he wanted to live as Jesus taught. That is really my takeaway from the study that I have. Francis is not a philosopher. He's not a person to question. He's not an analyzer. He says, Jesus says, be poor. He doesn't question this. He says he's going to be a voluntarily poor man. Jesus says, love your enemy. Francis says, that's what Jesus said. I'm going to find out why Jesus said this to me, because Jesus doesn't really explain it, right? He just says, love your enemies. Jesus says, be poor, sell everything you have and follow me. He doesn't say what you're going to get. He just says, if you believe, this is what I want you to do. And Francis takes these messages to heart. Forgiveness. There's over half of the messages, they say about 2/3 of the messages of Jesus is about forgiveness. Francis says, Jesus says right there, he teaches us how to pray. And in the Lord's Prayer, he talks about forgiveness. I'm going to forgive. And so these basic ideas, and of course the other thing that is very central to his message too is as a peacemaker. Now, the thing is, we all know these things, right? I mean, as I'm saying to you, you say, yeah, we know about that. But the thing is, we turn Jesus' statements into questions. Love my enemy? No, you must be joking. The guy hurt me. I'm going to love him? You know, be a peacemaker? No, I want to win. Right? Forgive someone who did me wrong? That doesn't make any sense. You know, none of these things, or be poor. I got to give away, I'm just going to voluntarily be poor. None of this makes sense. And we turn every one of these statements into a question. Francis found a way to make those statements again. Love your enemy. Be poor. And he takes these things and he just lives them and finds out where it takes him. And he revives the law, in a way, the lost message. If you go back to all the things we study, these things are all said. But we twist them around, right? We say, well, I'll be poor, but maybe not that poor. I'll forgive, but only when it's convenient for me. I'll be a peacemaker as long as it doesn't cost me anything. So we have to kind of put away logical questions when we talk about Jesus's life, well, Jesus's teachings and Francis's life. And instead, we just have to, what we can do here is try to see clearly where these things might take us, to at least think clearly about what it means to forgive and what being a peacemaker might mean. Pietro Bernardoni. The father of Francis was a man called Pietro Bernardoni. He was a successful businessman. He was a rich man, if not the richest man in Assisi. He made his money in cloth. He traveled to France and the Netherlands to the great cloth markets there, and he brought those cloths back to Assisi, sometimes sold them wholesale, sometimes had garments made for the rich, retail. On one of these trips, he met Pica, who became his wife. She was French. And Pietro would go away 2 or 3 times a year to the cloth fairs in France. And on one of these trips, Francis was born. And so his mother, Pica, named him Giovanni after St. John the Baptist, in honor of St. John the Baptist. Well, when Pietro came back and found out what his eldest son, I mean, he's Italian after all, the eldest son, he's going to inherit my fortune, named him after a hermit who lived in the desert and ate wild locusts and honey. I mean, you know, he was inflamed. But of course, he couldn't change the name. His name was legally Giovanni. But he said, from this point on, my son will be known as Francisco, which is a very unusual name. It actually kind of translates to Frenchy or Frenchman. And of course, why would his father name him such a name? Because he was planning to take his son to France to teach him the trade, and he figured it would probably endear him to the people in France. At about age 7, he gets the beginning of a very short education from a local priest. He learns a little bit of Latin. He learns the Our Father. He learns a couple of psalms. He learns how to sing. They teach him a little bit of arithmetic. At 10 years old, after 3 years, and it was only maybe 2 or 3 months a year, so he's a man of very little education. His father pulls him out and he says, you're going to come with me to France now and I'm going to teach you my trade. And he takes him up to France and he introduces him to all the influential people, all the people he's going to have to work with as the person who's going to take over his father's business. At 13, he becomes his father's apprentice, which means he works in the store. The family lives above the store. It's kind of a cute thing, right? Family lives above the store. They have the store downstairs. And now he learns how to sell within the store and how to get people to buy the wares and this kind of stuff. But, you know, Francis is a kid of his time. And at that time, chivalry was really a very powerful force in people's lives. You know, maybe 150 years ago, kids who were teenagers wanted to be pirates. And maybe after the Second World War, everyone wanted to be a soldier. Well, when Francis was born, if you were a teenager, you wanted to be a knight. You wanted to have a sword and sit upon a horse and fight for some nobleman, hoping that you would be knighted. Because the knights usually came not from the nobility, they came from the there was no middle class, but whatever you want to call it, came from the stock of people, and every boy was hoping that he would be able to fight in war, and some lord or king would say, this boy is really good, and knight him, and then he would have his own personal glory. He finally gets his chance when he's 20. The town of Assisi goes to war with the nearby town of Perugia. And Francis gets all duded up in his fancy clothes, gets on the horse with his sword, makes it halfway to Perugia, and is caught, and becomes a POW. He's a prisoner of war. And they toss him in the basement of a church. And he's there for 1 year. This part of Italy, as beautiful as it is, has a very cold winter. So it was very cold down in that basement. He lived on bread and dirty water for a year. And the summers were airless and hot down there. Finally, after a year, there was a little bit of peace between the two towns. His father gave some money to the Perugians, got his son back. And when he gets him back, Francis is contracted malaria. And he spends a year in bed, recuperating. Now Francis, before he got into war, he's a typical kind of teenager. He liked to party. He liked to run around town. In fact, he was known, his nickname was King of the Partygoers before this. He was, and everyone wanted to invite him because his father was rich, right? So we'd have a party. Hey, inviting Francis, he'll pay for the whole affair, we're going to have a great time. And he loved this. He loved the social life. When he came back, he found that this life wasn't really doing anything for him anymore. He kind of continued to participate in it, but he still had this dream that he wanted to be a knight. This he couldn't get rid of. But after about a year, he recovered, and another knight came along with another battle, and he's going to go there and he's going to become a knight again, and he gets all decked out and he gets back on the horse with his sword, and he makes it not very far out of Assisi, and he runs a fever, and he has a dream as he's lying in bed recuperating from this fever. He has a dream, and it says, go back to Assisi and you'll be told what to do. So he can't go on. The whole troop is going on to fight the war, and Francis is too sick. He goes home to Assisi. And now he says, you know, I tried twice to become a knight. His dreams of glory they just don't hold the same fascination for him. His life, he doesn't know what to do with himself. He's walking around. He's just wandering through the hills. And he wanders into a kind of rundown church called San Damiano. And he sits there. And he hears a voice. And the voice says to him, Francis, don't you see that my church is in ruin? Go and rebuild it for me. And Francis, with his typical, don't ask any questions, he says, that's what I got to do. I got to rebuild the churches. This church is in ruin. And he runs out and he starts asking people for stones and wood to rebuild the church. Well, here's the eldest son of the richest man in town begging building materials. You can imagine what his father thought of this, right? His father says, Francis, stop this. What do you have everything in front of you. You're going to be a rich man. You're going to take over my business. You're going to be secure for life. Stop going around and dishonoring the name of Bernardone. And Francis says, Dad, I have to. I have to rebuild the churches. His father takes him out in the public square, beats him up in front of everyone and says, see what my son's doing? He's not supposed to be doing this. As soon as he does that, Francis goes right back to collecting wood and stones and rebuilding the church of San Damiano. But he's still kind of working for his father. And he's still looking for money, but his father's not going to give him any extra money. His father sends him off on a business trip. And he has a bunch of cloth and a fancy horse, and he's all, you know, He's got nice clothes on. Francis loved nice clothes. As you can imagine, his father was a cloth merchant. And he gets to Spoleto where he's selling this stuff. And he comes to him, he says, I can make money. I'm going to sell the horse, the cloth, my clothes, and I'm going to take all the money and I'm going to give it to the priest at San Damiano so he can rebuild the church. And this is what he does. Well, he brings the money to the priest. The priest says, I know it's not your money. I'm not going to take it. This is your father's money. You can't do that. This is stolen money. And Francis throws the money at the priest. And of course, he then goes into hiding. And his father finds him after about 2 weeks. His friends are there bringing him food and everything, and he's hiding somewhere. And his father finally finds him, and he says, are you going to come to your senses? Are you going to stop this? Just come back, because they're very doting parents, right? They're willing to forgive their son for everything. Just come back, stop this nonsense, stop rebuilding the church, let's get back to business. Francis says, Father, I have to rebuild the church. And at that point, of course, the father says, I'm going to disown you. Because who am I going to pass my fortune and my business on to? Someone like you? I'll pass it on to another. He had 6 brothers and sisters. Another brother will just take it over. So he brings him, at that time, to take care of this, he would bring him in front of the bishop to handle this matter. So, and the Pietro Bernardone is standing there and says, don't you see what this boy's doing? Look what he did. And he lays out the whole case for the bishop. And the bishop turns to Francis and says, you did wrong, boy. Pay your father back what you owe him. Pay him back everything that you owe him. And Francis goes into the church. They're in the middle of the piazza, and of course everyone's there. It's like a reality TV show, right? So everyone's standing there watching what's going on. He goes into the church. A minute or two later, he comes out naked, holding the clothes that he was wearing, and he lays it down at his father's feet. And he says, up until now, I've called Pietro Bernardone my father. But from now on, I will only say, my Father who art in heaven. And this is one of the big breaking points in Francis's life. You might have heard of this story somewhere. It's actually, if you've been to Italy, you might see this. It's been depicted many, many times in artwork. What's the relationship between a father and a son? I mean, what does a father want from a son? What does a son want from the father? What would you say the relationship between a father and a son? What's the basic ideas or the basic relationship between a father and a son? What would you say?
The father is supposed to teach his son what he's supposed to do in life.
That's right. His father guides a child through his life to be a success. He's going to teach him the ways of the world, right? That's one of the things he's going to do. What's another thing that a father does for a son? Protects him, right? And protects him by giving him a home, by giving him security, by providing for him, right? So he gives him more, he makes everything very nice so that he can grow up big and strong and go out there and do something. Anything else that you can think of?
Well, as you said, the father wants to pass to him everything he has.
Right.
So the father wanted, but
he wants to provide. Another thing is obeying, right? A son obeys his father. This is especially in the Mediterranean countries, and not just only there. So now he's faced with these 2 fathers. He's faced with Pietro Bernardone and God, the 2 fathers that he's looking at. And he's saying, obey, provide, and security. Now, who am I going to look at? I know what my dad's offering to me. I can obey him and do what he wants me to do. He's providing everything for me, and he can certainly give me security. But is this what he's looking for now? He says no. He says, that's why he says, I'm not going to call Pietro Bernardone my father anymore. I'm going to call my Father in heaven my father. in fact, from this time on, he actually uses his father's name almost as a curse. Not in the sense that because he's not really, he never criticized his father. This is something that I hope to, you don't misunderstand. He never disrespected his father. He never criticized his father for his life. He simply rejected it. He said, Dad, I know what you're offering to me, and that's not my life. My life is to be with God and to find God and the security and the guidance that I'm going to get from a spiritual nature where you're just providing for my material needs. At this time, too, another thing that happened, we're so used to the idea of money, getting money and amassing money, and you can have a bank account and the money goes. I mean, money's been around for a really long time, but people used money more like a mode of exchange. Just the convenience. When you went from one town to another, you used money as a way of exchanging goods. But people didn't think about big piles of money until around Francis's time. That's when things started to change. And so Pietro Bernardone was one of these guys, and the first or second generation of people who could make money like this through import-export or something like this and actually amass a great amount of money. And the way people showed how much money they had was in the manner that they dressed. And so Pietro Bernardone was a big man at that time. So Francis turns, he says, this money thing is really causing a lot of problems. It's taking us away from God. So Francis drops out of the money economy. He doesn't criticize it. He just drops out entirely. And he takes a very hard line through his whole life, and you're going to see that this actually causes problems later on for him. He says, people who follow Francis later on, as we'll see, weren't even allowed to touch money. The way a Franciscan lived is by doing day work, and then the person would give them food or shelter or whatever, and then the next day they would do day work again. And when there was no day work, they would beg. This was Francis's life. He says, this is how we live. And it's interesting because Francis says our view of poverty reflects our relation to God. Let me say that again. Our view of poverty, the way we see poverty, is an indication of how we relate to God. Well, maybe we should get this out of the way. What does money do for us, really? Think about why people want money. Should be pretty easy. We all think about it from time to time, maybe a lot of times. Comfort, one of the things, right. What else does money do for you? Security, a really big thing, right? This is like, I can take care of myself. I got this money. If I need something, the money will get it for me. You see? So once we put our security in money, we don't really have that much need for God, do we? God becomes kind of a shadowy when I need something else. But Francis is saying, your idea of security is all about is in money, that you could provide for yourself, that you could take care of yourself, that you're self-sufficient. And when he gets rid of the money, who's he relying on? He's relying on God at that point. And of course, this is a radical, not just radical poverty, but it's also voluntary poverty, because not everyone is voluntarily poor. But he chooses to be voluntarily poor to see where it's going to lead him. Jesus said, be poor. Jesus said, give away everything you have and come and follow me. And Francis says, there's something to this. I don't know. I can't explain it to you. I'm not going to make it illogical for you. But I will tell you, the way it makes sense is if you put your security in money, you're saying something about your relationship to God. And he takes a very hard line on this poverty issue for that. It's something really to think about. This is not something I can give to you in a couple of minutes, but when you start to think about where you're going to get your security from, and where, you know, as soon as that money goes away, where are you going to go run to someone else for security? Are you going to go ask someone else for money? Are you going to try to provide for yourself? Are you going to try to take care of yourself? Or are you going to let God provide for you? And Francis is 22 years old when he leaves home. He lives another 20 years without ever touching money. So Francis is now, he's not only poor, but he's homeless. He has no money, he left his father, and he's not living in his father's house. Now, in Italy at that time, every town had a wall around it for protection. And outside the walls, believe it or not, the churches, some of the churches like San Damiano that he rebuilt are outside the walls. And there's one other thing outside the walls: lepers, leper colonies. And Francis leaves the town. He's homeless now. He's not home in the town, within the town walls. And he goes and wanders outside, outside the walls of the town. Now, when he was with his father and a rich man, if he would be traveling around and just know that there's a leprosarium 2 miles away, he'd hold his nose and say, oh, because the smell was pretty bad. I mean, I've never smelled a leprosarium, but from all accounts, the smell of rotting flesh carries quite a ways, and it's not something that you really want to, not something that's very pleasant to smell. But Francis goes out and he comes across a colony of lepers. Now, lepers were legally dead. They had no rights under the law. I mean, these people were totally rejected by society. And they were cared for by the church, but the church saw their way of life as, you know, the result of, that they had leprosy was the result of leading a sinful life. Some people think of this way about AIDS, for example, right? So you might think about it in the same way. People look at it not just as a disease, but it's not just a disease of the body, but it's a disease of the soul. I mean, this is people living a degraded life in some way. So it's kind of funny, the church is taking care of him and saying, but you're living a sinful life, that's why you're a leper. Lepers, of course, lived outside. They were forbidden to come into the city. And if they came near to the city wall to go begging, they had to have 2 pieces of wood that they'd clap together like this so that everyone would know that they were coming. And if anyone felt a little generous that day, they'd leave food for them outside the city wall and then run into their home afraid of any kind of contact with the lepers. So Francis is there outside, and he sees this group of lepers. He focuses on the one who looks really the worst. And he has nothing. Right? He's just given all his clothes away. Someone gave him a little tunic to wear, something that the farmers would wear at the time. And that's what he's wearing. He goes up to one of the lepers, and he has nothing to give him. And he embraces the leper. And he stays with that leper, and he nurses him, and he binds up his wounds. Now, Francis's identification with the lepers, I mean, what would you say? Why would you think he would do such a thing? I mean, what attraction or what identification maybe would Francis have with lepers?
Charity, love.
He's not in leprosy himself, right? Hmm?
Love.
Just charity.
Just charity? Certainly, the charity is a big piece. What were you going? I'm sorry.
Love. He wanted to love them.
But think about how he's identifying.
Maybe he wants to see what's feel like to be in that situation.
Certainly that kind of identification. But he was now kind of in that situation, wasn't he?
He was pretty close to the fortune.
I think you could see Jesus, the outcast. Jesus was for the Gentiles, for everyone, woman, older,
and seek, never judge or prejudice, or have any kind of prejudice. So you have to see the face of Jesus in every single picture.
That's right. One thing you said was interesting. He's an outsider now, isn't he? Think about the people inside the city walls. They're at home. They've arrived, right? They're not going anywhere. This is my home. This is where security is. This is where my family is. I'm okay. But now Francis is outside the walls. He's not at home, even though he knows Assisi. He knows exactly where he is, but he's not at home, is he? He's kind of on a journey at this point, like all of us are. People that are in the towns are no longer on a journey. They've arrived at the end, or they think they've arrived at the end, right? So they surround themselves with the security of this city as if they've arrived at the end of their journey. But their journey is their life, right? And Francis is now outside of the city walls with the lepers as an outsider, just like the lepers are outside. They're living a human life, but they're not at home. They're wanderers. They're strangers. They're in the midst of everything that they know, they're not at home. And this is one of the things that Francis, and as you mentioned, this is Jesus, right? Jesus was an outsider. Jesus didn't go schmoozing around with the people in the Sanhedrin. No, he didn't. If someone came up and if a rabbi came up and talked to him, or the Pharisees or the Sadducees came up and talked to him, he would talk with them. But he wasn't palling out with them. That was it. He was palling out. He was with the outsiders, as it were, or the low people. And this is again where he takes this identification from, of being an outsider. And the other thing is, I think he starts to see this idea of what compassion really means. I mean, compassion means to feel with, right? To suffer with, not to feel with, but to suffer with. And he starts to see this and say, you know, here are these people outside suffering. I mean, really suffering. They have no home, they have no security, they have no place to live, they're rejected of society, they have no home, and yet they're humans. They're human beings. And how do you find meaning in a situation? How do you find meaning in this kind of life, being an outsider? How would you find meaning? I mean, you would have to say to yourself, death can't be the end. That's how you would find meaning, because the people in town seem to have found their meaning in the security of being home. That's the meaning of life. I mean, it's kind of funny when you think about it, when you think, regardless of what we might say, the way we live, the meaning of our lives, the meaning is just satisfying my next desire. We're not really thinking about the meaning of life as the whole of our life, and death as some kind of measure of a journey that you've taken. Right? It's just the next thing I'm going to do, the next thing I'm going to do, because you are now secure. You think you've reached kind of, I'm here, I'm secure, I'm at home. And all I got to keep on doing is just doing the same thing and maintaining everything just the way it is, as if at the end of the journey, that's going to bring you somewhere. But these people are forced, through their situation, forced to face the idea that they can't do that. They can't think about satisfying their next desire, because they don't have a way of satisfying their next desire. So the meaning of their life becomes death. The meaning of their life is only known in death. And in the same way that Jesus' life, when you think about it, you know, if you reflect on Jesus' life, he was clearly an outsider. He's born a poor man in a manger and died on a cross. And this is kind of a very unusual. You think about the Buddha, you think about the Greek gods or the Roman gods or the Egyptian gods. I mean, these people were, you know, they were doing all right, right? They had a home, they had money, they had all these things. Jesus is the only major figure that's born in a manger and dies on a cross. This means something to Francis. This means the poverty, the outsideness of Jesus. And Jesus is saying, don't look for your security inside the walls of your city. Don't look for security within the money, because that's not going to get it for you. And these are the lessons that Francis, somehow this makes sense to him. I mean, it makes sense to me, but of course my day-to-day decisions are not based in the same way that Francis just was able, he just went out and did it. I said, I don't know where it's going to take me. But this is how I believe from what he's saying, this is how I'm thinking he's thinking about it. But he's still not the Francis that we know from the pictures. He still looks kind of like a hermit. He's got a tunic on, he's got a leather belt, because everyone kept their money in the belts at the time. They didn't have pockets, right? And he had sandals, and he wanders into another church. And the message that day is, when you go on your journey, don't take gold for your belt, and don't take 2 tunics, and don't take any sandals, and don't take a bag, and don't take anything. Just take what you have and go on the journey. This is the journey of a poor man. This is the journey that is from Matthew. And Francis, again, I mean, you almost know what Francis is going to do. He hears this thing, he takes off his belt, he kicks off his sandals, gives them to somebody, and he wraps a rope around his belt to show that he has no money. As I said, people kept money in their belts at the time. A rope, he couldn't keep any money. He is now totally dependent on God. He has nothing left of the world to rely on. And he says, I'm going to rely totally on God. And he's just going to see where this leads him. So he looks at the 2 things that Jesus is doing. One of the things that Jesus' ministry really contains only 2 parts of it, the actual ministry part of it, right? He's a healer. He goes around and heals. And what's the other thing that Jesus does? He preaches, right? So Francis is already healing the lepers. He's helping them not healing them in the same way Jesus was, but he's healing them by nursing them. He says, the other thing I got to do if I'm going to follow Jesus is go out and preach. So now Francis is going around, and Francis was a very happy person. Everyone says he was like an infectiously happy person. It was hard to be, he might infuriate you, but you could never be mad at him. That's kind of the description, I think, one of his biographers says. So he'd go around, and his message was very different from the messages that everything was kind of fire and brimstone at the time. God's going to come down, and the wrath of God, and everything is going to be, and people are used to this kind of preaching. And Francis goes around, and he says, Jesus didn't teach that way. Jesus taught a message of love and peace. And that's what he's going around and doing. In fact, who knows what the first word of Jesus' ministry is? After he gets baptized, what's the first word Jesus says? In Greek, Lucas is learning Greek. In Greek, the word is metanoia. It means something very close. You almost got it. It means, that was translated as repent. But repentance means change your mind, change your thinking. And this is one of the main ideas that Francis is doing. He's saying, change your thinking. You think that your security is in this world, but you got to change your thinking, just as Jesus asks us to do. And so he's going around and he's saying, love God, love the people around you. This is a very violent time. They claim that everyone in Assisi was armed. Everyone had some kind of weapon. And people did cruel things to animals and to each other, and there was all sorts of violence going on. It was just a daily occurrence. People just live with this kind of thing. And Francis is going around and saying, Jesus is talking about peace here. And of course, being the kind of person he is, he starts to attract followers. I always think this is pretty amazing. I wonder if us go around on the street, start preaching, and then people are starting to say, hey, I like what you're saying. Can I do the same thing that you did? I don't know. It seems incredible to me. But this is what people did. Francis would go around and preach, and people go, Francis, I want to be with you. I want to go around and do the same thing you're doing. And Francis, he said, come on. He didn't ask any questions. You asked Francis to join, come on. He didn't care who you were or what you did or anything. Kind of, you know, in a way like Jesus, he had his apostles, his disciples were not, you know, not the pick of the crop. He had,
No judgment.
yeah, just come on. And so he gets people to start following him on this thing. But of course, they're going around and they're giving all this message. Give money away. You don't want money. Money is taking you away from God. And I mean, you can imagine what people are thinking of when these people are going around. And not only that, but you know, the church was very powerful at this time, and people were worried. They said, if we actually start listening to this guy, we could get ourselves in real trouble. So Francis came around. They'd throw rocks at him and mud and all sorts of things. Sometimes people thought they were fools or imposters. They didn't know who they were. They're just going around like a street, like someone on 42nd Street just putting up a little podium and starts talking. So Francis realized he has to get some kind of authority. He decides to go to Rome, to the Pope, to see the Pope, to ask him if he could preach. This is kind of funny, you know? It'd be like one of us decide, oh, let's just go off to Rome. I got an idea. Maybe I go talk to the Pope. And it was just about as hard to see the Pope then as it would be now. But amazingly, he managed, the Bishop of Assisi happened to be in Rome at the time, and he pulled some strings and he got an audience with the Pope. And amazingly, he coming up to the Pope and just says, well, Pope says, well, what do you want to do? And he says, I just want to tell people to come back to God. I just want to go around and preach the good news of Jesus to people. That's all I want to do. And the Pope grants him this. And then they do that thing, that tonsure, you know, where they do that. They don't have to do that for me. But Francis, they had to do that for. And that became his approval, his kind of sign that he was okay, that people could listen to him, as it were. So one of the stories that always grabbed me as far as preaching goes is, it also has to do with an animal. And you know, there's lots of stories of Francis talking to animals, right? And there's a lot of ways for us to understand talking to how Francis might talk to animals. I mean, one is that we know that there are people who have, you know, if you have an animal yourself, you can kind of talk to it, right? I mean, you're not going to talk dog or cat. You're going to talk through, well, ultimately what I think Francis sees is he lets the communication up to God. He says, I'm going to talk to the animals, but it's not my job to get the point across. It's really God's job. Because God, especially Jesus, after the resurrection, he tells the disciples, go and preach to all the creatures of the earth. This is Francis again. He doesn't ask any questions. He said all the creatures, right? So there's birds, there's trees, there's rocks, whatever's around, God's created this stuff. And anything that's around here kind of is what they call a footprint back to God. So everything that was created tells you something about what was on God's mind. And somehow Francis is able to say, well, if we're all God's creatures, there's some way for us to communicate. I don't know how it happens. That's not my job to worry about how it happens. Well, my job is to believe that that is true. So the story here is the wolf at Gubbio. Gubbio is another town very close by to Assisi. And Francis lived there for a little while. And outside the town, outside the wall of the town, of course, a fierce wolf took up residence. And people were afraid. This thing was eating not only animals, but if people went outside, it was attacking men and women and children and eating them up. And people were afraid. They were going out armed like they were going to go into battle with swords and bats and everything. And even then, they couldn't defend themselves against this fierce wolf. So Francis is living there, and he takes compassion on the people there, and he says, I'm going to go talk to the wolf for you. People go, no, don't do that. This wolf really means business. You're gonna get yourself in a big trouble. Francis says, And he says, he puts all his faith in God. He says, this isn't me doing anything. This is God working through me. And he goes and he walks off. And the whole town is kind of going out with him. And then after a while, you know, they get to the gate and then they stop and Francis keeps going, right? And they're all standing there looking out the window, seeing what happens with Francis. He walks a little ways and the wolf comes out, charges at Francis with his mouth open. And Francis makes the sign of the cross and says, Brother Wolf, you're not going to, in the name of God, you're not going to do me any harm or anyone else. And the wolf just stops. Closes his mouth and lays there. And he comes over to Francis and he just sits, lays next to Francis, and Francis says, you know, Brother Wolf, you're doing a lot of damage in these parts. You're not only killing creatures of God without his permission, but you're killing human beings made in the image of God, and for that you should be hanged as a murderer. And he says, and everyone in the town is complaining about you, and they don't like you. But I want to make peace with you. I want to make it so that all the men will forgive you for what you've done, and you're not going to harm anyone anymore, and we're going to make peace. And the wolf relaxes a little more, and Francis goes on. He says, I know, he says, I'm going to make it so that you're not going to suffer hunger anymore, because I know that whatever wrong you did because you were hungry. And I'm going to make it so that the men of this town will feed you, and this will make a peace between the two of us. He says, do you agree? And you know, the wolf is there just hanging out, saying, okay, well, whatever. So he says, come into the town now, and we're going to tell the people about what we agree. And Francis and the wolf go back into town, and everyone's standing there with this wolf, and Francis is walking back into town. He goes to the big piazza, the plaza in the middle of the town, and everyone's there in the town looking at this. Everyone thinks this is the most amazing thing. And Francis takes this opportunity to preach. And this is what he preaches. He says, God allows these things to happen because of sin. Now, of course, that's code for being far from God. He says, God allows these things because of your own sinful ways. And everyone here is worried about this wolf eating your body. But you're not worried about your life eating up your soul, the decisions you're making, eating up your soul. He says, everyone's there worried about this wolf and forgetting about their soul. He says, so turn to God and make peace with the wolf and start working on yourself. Of course, that's kind of like a paraphrase, you know. They don't say, he wouldn't say something like that. But and you know, he's a very short message. You know? Jesus didn't give long sermons, and neither did Francis. So he says, okay, now this is the agreement that we made. You will feed the wolf every day, and the wolf won't harm anyone. So he asked the people, do you agree? He asked the wolf, do you agree? Everyone agreed. And they said for 2 years, the wolf just wandered around the town. He would go into people's homes. People would feed him. And he lived there for 2 years and then died of old age. And I always like the last part of the story. Says, people were sad, not because they missed the wolf, but because every time they saw the wolf walking around town, it reminded them of the sermon of St. Francis. It reminded them that they could make peace with the thing that they think is their enemy. There's so much, I mean, we could spend the whole lecture just on this story alone, right? It's a very deep and powerful story. And this is the kind of thing that you do. You read a story like this, and then the first time you read it, you go, oh, okay. And then you read it again, and you see a little something, and you see a little something. But, well, you tell me, what do you think some of the central points of this, I mean, what is this story? Because it's not just the story, right? It's trying to tell you, it's trying to let you into Francis's experience, not his thinking necessarily, because I don't know if we could really get there. But what's Francis trying to do here? What's his central concern? Love your enemy. One great thing, right? I mean, which one of us, if we were Francis, or at least maybe I should personalize it, if I was Francis and I said I'm going to go out and make peace with the wolf, part of me would be saying, I hope everything works out. But part of me would say, I better have something in my back pocket in case it doesn't work out, right? But Francis never had this doubt. Francis says, I'm going to make peace with my enemy, with our enemy. Because, and it's not me who's making the peace, right? This is what he says. He put all his faith in God. This is you remember St. Francis's prayer. It's funny no one mentioned St. Francis's prayer at the beginning. By the way, that prayer was written during the First World War by a French aristocrat. It was not written by St. Francis. But I mean, it's a great thing to know. But what's the opening line there? Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Francis's idea is that it's not up to him. He is an instrument of God's peace. In fact, I think before I get on to this, I just was thinking about this. Some brother comes up to me and says, Francis, you know, I don't get it. Why does everyone want to follow you? Why does everyone want to hear what you have to say? You're not a good-looking man. You don't have any special wisdom. You're pretty simple and kind of stupid, actually. And why do people care about you at all? And Francis says, you know, I'm glad you asked that question. He says, the reason why is because when God wants to do something, he picks the most worthless person, the biggest sinner, the person who has no qualifications at all, and he works through him. And he says, that's what he did in my case. He says, in fact, if God had given a criminal the capabilities that he had given to me, he would have been much better off, because I'm not even using anything that God gave me. You know, I'm always I'm still trying to let God work through me, and I'm fighting him every step of the way. So this idea of being an instrument is a very important one, because when God is using you as an instrument, where's the center of your life? Are you the center of your life anymore? Is it what you want to do? Is it Francis going out and making peace with the wolf? No, Francis isn't going out and making peace with the wolf. It's not him that's going out there and doing it. He's called to do this. And he feels this very much. Another thing, another central message here is forgiveness, right? Well, I mean, what's the wrong way to forgive? Well, maybe we should get this out of the way first. With resentment, right? How do we do that with resentment? How do we forgive with resentment? What kind of things do we say?
You can forgive but cannot forget.
Yeah, I can forgive but I can't forget, right? What else? Yeah, he didn't know any better. Right?
Don't come closer to me.
Or, that was very nice, but just stay away from me, or something like that. But what Francis is saying, I think it's a very telling thing. We have a problem probably with the word sin, because it just, it irritates people, because it's a loaded word, and we're not really sure exactly what they're talking about. But for Francis, these kinds of words are code. He uses them in that way. And when Francis is talking about, he says, the reason why God allows the wolf to come into your life is because of sin. He starts with this idea, with Jesus' idea, right? He says, maybe I have to back up for a minute. He starts off with this idea, what does it say in the Lord's Prayer, right? Forgive us as we forgive those. What's the meaning of that? Forgive us as we forgive those. What's the relationship there? The relationship is you're going to be forgiven to the extent that you forgive. And every situation that comes into our life is an opportunity for us to forgive, so that we can be forgiven. We always think about forgiveness for the other person. It's going to benefit the other person. No. That wrong that came into your life, the wolf that came into town because the people in the town needed forgiveness. What do they need forgiveness of? Forgiveness of all the little things that we do each day that turn away from God. The things, the self-centeredness that we have. Every one of those things is a sin, is a turning from God, is a turning away from God. And those little things that come in from the outside, or the big things that come in from the outside, whatever they are opportunities for us to be healed. And a recognition, because what do we usually do when something wrong happens, right? It's like, why me, or why does that have to happen, right? We're always pushing it away, like we don't want this bad thing to happen to us. But Francis is saying those bad things are happening to you because you need forgiveness. And that bad thing that's come into your life, when you forgive, you're forgiving something. You're forgiving yourself. And this is, I can't make sense of it, but this is what Jesus is telling us. This is the promise of Jesus' forgiveness. You will be forgiven as you forgive. So everything that comes into it. That's why Francis is so happy to do this. Every time something really, unpleasant comes into his life, you're saying, well, the guy should just run away from this thing. Leave. Don't hang around Gubbio. Let's all leave. And Francis says, this is happening because I need to be forgiven. And he's happy. He says, look, I'm going to be forgiven. I'm going to go out there and talk to the wolf so that I could be forgiven. This is how Francis sees forgiveness. Through the words of Jesus. Through the mechanism of Jesus. The mechanism that Jesus, mechanism is kind of the wrong word. Through the method that Jesus shows us of how we are forgiven. Also, forgiveness, when you think about it this way, because when something bad happens, you kind of have this choice. You can either forgive or you could resent, right? Or you could punish the person, right? That's another option. But punishment causes pain and suffering in the world, which requires more forgiveness, you see? So now you've just compiled the amount of forgiveness you have to do. Francis says, forgiveness, he says forgiveness destroys faults. Think about this. This is very interesting. If something wrong happens to you, so you can't take the act back, right? If someone did something wrong and there was a consequence of some kind, you can't take that consequence away. But through forgiveness, you could wipe out the evil that's been done. And this is where the mercy of forgiveness comes in. This is where the promise of forgiveness comes in. Through our forgiveness, we bring that love and that mercy to the situation. We don't wipe out if, the worst case, someone murders somebody, They can't bring the person's life back. But they can wipe out the evil that's in your heart through mercy. And this is, again, the central issue or the central promise of Jesus' way of forgiving. He says forgiveness can wipe out faults, can wipe out evil in the world. We have the capability of wiping out evil in the world and wiping out evil in ourselves. And I think we did talk about the peacemaking aspect, how we might meet the wolf. And why the wolf didn't harm. Why didn't the wolf harm?
Because he didn't have anything to be harmed of.
Yeah.
Living a life of God.
That's right. He did, because like they say, animals might sense fear in someone. Francis didn't have, he didn't have him like me, something in the back pocket, worrying that in case things didn't work out, I have, because that fear would be there. Francis went out and said, I'm doing God's work here, right? We have a couple more minutes. I was going to talk some about the Crusades, just very briefly. I don't know if I could. This was the time of the Crusades. The Muslims took over all of North Africa, and then about 100 years before Francis was born, they took over the city of Jerusalem, which was you know, it was a place that people would make pilgrimages to go there. And now, you know, Christians lived in Muslim nation, but they couldn't try to convert anyone. If they tried to convert, they were killed. That was the idea. You could practice, but you couldn't go up to a Muslim and try to convert him to Christianity. And plus, I think there was just a lot of hard feelings that this was Christianity's, you know, birthplace, and now the Muslims have it. So the popes started these many crusades, and people would go out. You know, all of them failed in the end. But Francis was actually born during the Second Crusade, and he was too young to join the Third Crusade. But the Fourth Crusade, he got it in his head he was going to go out and join. Now, if Francis is going out to a crusade, what do you think he's trying to do? He's not carrying the sword anymore, right? He's a grown, you know, he's not doing that anymore. He's going out to try to make peace, right? That's his idea. So Francis gets on a boat. 2 days later, big storm comes along, ship blows him back to Italy. This is the story of Francis's life. Everything, I mean, I'm sorry to say it, but he is a failure. Everything that he did in his life, like this, turns out to be a failure. His whole life. And as we'll even see, it causes him a lot of distress later on in life, too. I think I'm trying to do something here. I get blown off course. He comes back, and he doesn't know what to do. He's laying down. He's sick. I mean, he's still got malaria, right? And he's got a lot of other things that going on. He's got stomach problems. He's got liver problems. And he says, you know, maybe I should just become a hermit. Stop this preaching stuff. I should just go. But Francis never trusted himself. So he wrote to his two dearest companions, Sister Clare, which is a whole different story, right? You might have heard it, and Brother Sylvester. And he says, should I become a hermit? And both of them answer immediately the same thing. They both say, you should go on preaching because you were called not just for yourself, but for others too. And Francis, typical Francis, sick as he is, he gets up and he plans a trip to Morocco to try to make some peace in Morocco. He spends 4 months on foot, and he gets to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. He gets sick. Still doesn't make it, right? He gets sick, and they nurse him back to health, and he realizes he's just too sick to go to Morocco to do anything. He goes back to Assisi. The Fifth Crusade comes along, and Francis says, I'm going to try one more time. This time, he has a lot of ideas about what he wants to do, but I think the way it's presented is he really wanted to become a martyr. He was hoping that he would go into the Muslim land. He's going to talk to the Sultan and try to convert the Sultan to Christianity. Something like going to the Pope and trying to make him become Buddhist or something like that. You know what I mean? This is a really crazy idea that he has, right? But he's going to go, plus he knows that if he goes and tries to convert a Muslim, even the attempt is going to cause him to be killed. No less if he does actually convert, right? But, so he hops on the ship, and he actually gets to Egypt this time. He's a success. He made it to the Fifth Crusade. And he sees, it's one of the bloodiest crusades there is, and it's led by this guy on the Christian side who's like megalomaniac. He has a very small force, and he insists that he's going to win. And every time they go into battle, they lose more and more men. And the Sultan on the Muslim side keeps on saying, look, let's make peace. And he says, no, I'm going to win. So they keep going back into battle, and it's a very, very bloody battle. And Francis, in his usual way, no one knows, he can't explain these things. He actually gets an audience with the Sultan. And guess what? The Sultan loves him. He thinks he's great. And Francis goes in there, preaches the word of God to the Muslim, and tells him how great God is. And the Muslim says, you know, by law, I should kill you. He said, but you've risked your life to save my soul. in your belief. And he says, for that, I respect you. And actually, Francis stays with the Sultan for about 2 weeks, and then he gets safe passage back to, back to the ship, and he goes back to Assisi, right? When he gets back to Assisi, now this is about 10, 12 years after the order starts. There's 5,000 Franciscans. They're actually called Franciscans at this point because they have an okay from Rome. 5,000 people in 12 years. Well, you can imagine some of them don't know who Francis is. They just know his name, right? He gets back, and what's happening? Well, first of all, people are arguing and saying, this poverty thing, we don't really like this idea. And what happens when the friars get old? They can't work anymore. We got to take care of these people. What happens when they get sick? We got to do things. When the weather's not here. Plus, there's sometimes that there's 50 of us in town. There's not enough work for us. And then you beg out on the street. We're becoming a burden to society. We need money. Francis says no. He says, there's no compromise on the money issue. He says, not only that, but we're worried about authority. You just kept on inviting anyone you wanted to become a Franciscan. I mean, you don't know, these people might be crazy. You don't know what their intentions are. There's no rule. You don't know, what does it mean to be a Franciscan? He says, that's the concern of God. This person has come to us and says he wants to join us. That's all that I need. But he's seeing that his way is causing division. And Francis steps down. He says, my order, let me see if I can, I says, Lord, I give you back the family which up until now you've entrusted to me. And he realizes that he doesn't want a power struggle. He sees that things are changing and he's powerless to change them. The only power he could have is by causing more warfare or dissension, maybe is a better word than war. And he remains subject to whoever the leader is up until the end of his life. And this is an interesting thing too. Obedience is a big thing if you become a priest or a monk or something like that. Obedience is a big thing. Of course, even if you join the army, obedience is a big thing. But why obey? What's the big thing about obeying? Try to connect something between obeying and God, and see what Francis might be thinking about here. Why?
Peace.
But peace for sure.
Again, humility.
Humility, right? I mean, I'm subject to somebody else. Respect, too.
To serve.
I'm sorry?
To trust.
To trust that the person is going to do the right thing for you? You mean something like that? Sure.
To serve.
And to serve, right?
The smallest of all.
Yes, all these things are very true. And Francis is seeing that in a way, the same way that poverty reflects our idea of our relationship to God, so does obedience. If you say, I'll obey my boss sometimes, but not other times, well, Francis is saying, that's no different from how you're dealing with God. You're saying some things are okay and some things aren't. Because there's lots of arbitrary things that happen in our life. And we could say, well, that's not God's will, or God has nothing to do with that, right? I mean, we pick and choose here. And so we just say, well, when it's to my advantage, then I'll obey. But when it's not, I won't. But if God really is over our whole life, we can't pick and choose. So if we pick and choose among each other, we're also doing the same thing with God. So obedience becomes a big thing for him. And when he steps down, he just says, it doesn't matter. He defended priests who we would not think were doing their duty. But Francis says they're priests. And they have a job to do. And you are going to respect them as priests. Regardless of your opinion of them. Regardless of whether you think they're good priests or not. Because without that total obedience to someone, you are also not totally obedient to God. In the same way that he thinks about money. So he keeps on tying all these ideas together. You know, so now think about it. He's kind of a failure in every way, right? He's a failure as an eldest son, right? He's founded an order and he kind of got booted out. He tried to become a martyr, and they didn't make a, he was such a nice guy they couldn't even kill him. He tried to make peace. He couldn't do that. So at the end of his life, 2 years before he dies, right? He's a very sick man. Actually, he gets something else nasty happen to him when he goes to Egypt. He gets trachoma, which is a disease of the eye, and he eventually goes blind because of that. I mean, the guy's, pretty much has any disease you can imagine. Francis is right on top of it. He's got it. So he comes back and he feels himself to be a total failure. He says, everything I've tried. He says, maybe I'm just going to give this whole thing up. I'm going to get married and have a family. And one day, he's out in the snow, and he builds 7 mounds. And he's sitting there looking at them, and one of his brothers comes and he says, Francis, what are you doing? He says, this is my family. He has me and my wife, my 2 daughters, my 2 sons, and the servant. And he says, quick, get them all coats. They're freezing to death, right? And then Francis looks at him and he says, this is going to take me from God. He's struggling with this idea his whole life. He says, if I could become a family man. But I know that's not what God wants me to do. And I know by doing it, all I'm doing is evading my duty, evading what God has asked me to do. And I think it's really something to think about, that up until the end of his life, he suffered enormous temptations every day. But he fought to give in, not to give in to them. And that's the trick, because it's something, it's very powerful to think about, for me anyway, that you don't have to worry about wiping out temptations from your life. You will be tempted all the time. The problem is when you kind of get comfortable with the temptation and you think it's really not all that bad and you can give into it. And that's when it really becomes a dangerous thing. So up until the end, Francis is there. He has sexual desires. He has desires to become a family man. All these different desires he has. And he says, I'm just not going to give in to them. I'm not going to get comfortable with them. So he's sitting around one day and he's talking to his best buddy, Brother Leo. And, like I said, he feels himself to be a failure. He says, Leo, what's true joy? Leo being his best friend, he doesn't worry about it. He says, I'm not even going to try this one, to himself. Right? He says, he gets his pen and a pad out. He says, tell me, Francis, what's true joy? So Francis says, it's the middle of winter. It's at night. It's snowing, it's raining, there's mud on the floor. And I'm coming back from a long trip from Spoleto, not so far away. And in the distance, I see the Porziuncolo, which is the Church of St. Mary. Francis didn't have a home after he left his father, but if you have anywhere that might be a home, it was the Porziuncolo. So he's trudging through the snow, and he sees the Porziuncolo. And he's thinking about true joy. What would true joy be in this case? The Porziuncolo, getting in, right? It's cold. He wants to get there. He goes up to the door, knocks on the door. After a long time, a brother comes out. He says, I'm Brother Francis. Please let me in for the night. And the brother says, this is no decent hour for you to be out. What kind of nerve you have coming knocking at my door at this hour? And no decent person would do that. Get away. Go out of here. Closes the door. Francis knocks on the door again. The brother opens up the door and says, what do you want? He says, please, brother, let me in for the night. He says, look, you're stupid and simple, and there's so many great people in here, in this Porziuncolo. We don't need you. Go away. Closes the door again. Francis knocks on the door again. Brother opens up. He says, are you still here? And then Francis says, in code, this is code for Francis, he says, in the name of God, please let me in for the night. And the brother says, look, I already told you. It's late. We don't need you. Go find somewhere else to go. And he closes the door. And Francis says, Brother Leo, if I had patience, not disturbed, that would be true joy and true virtue and the salvation of the soul. This is a story that is very interesting to reflect on, because what's really happening here? We're thinking about if he would have been let into the Portiuncula and we would have said that was true joy, what kind of joy would that have been? He would have coming home. He would have been, been sitting there with a cup of cocoa and having a nice warm bed to sleep in, and he thinks this is joy, right? This is what we would all think joy is: going home, being comfortable, being around people who love you. And he says, no, the true joy is staying away from the idea that that is true joy. Because that's not going, because the ego wants to stay where it is, right? The ego always wants everything to be just the way it wants it to be. But God's will is the thing that happens moment by moment, if you think about it that way, right? I mean, everything that happens is the will of God. We could fight against it with our own will, but everything that happens is the will of God. So when you suffer a trial like this, like trying to go home and you're not getting in there, those trials that humiliate us are actually, again, a blessing to St. Francis. He looks at them as blessings. And why would that be? Why would a trial be so important to you? Because remember, the ego wants to stay where it is, right? The ego doesn't want to change. I'm very happy where I am. But now I've run into a situation that has pushed me past my own limits. Right? I mean, what's he going to do at this point?
Build a virtue that he didn't have.
Build a shelter he doesn't have. In some way, he says, I can't do it. It's not up to me. I can't do it anymore. I can't provide for myself anymore. And again, the salvation of the soul, as he's talking about, is because he's pushed beyond. He's pushed beyond his natural limits, beyond the limits of being comfortable in the Portiuncula. Right? So, and again, there's, I think it says he's looking to endure mistreatments patiently, as Jesus talks about, right? He says that's like, what's our response to violence and suffering? We're going to fight against it, right? Jesus says, love your enemies. And again, the idea is that every one of these ideas, every one of these sayings, every one of these commands of Jesus will lead us past our own comfort, our own ego. So, I thought this was interesting too, because Francis talks about this again in a roundabout way. When something happens that we don't like, probably what's the first thing that we do, right? When something happened that we don't like it. Ah! Right? You're going to complain. You're going to say, I was this and this was that, and the next thing you're going to have some kind of external response to it. Francis says the first thing to do is stop the external response. We shouldn't be involved in complaining to other people. In fact, Francis says when you're in the mood to complain, he says go and pray. Only come when you can smile if people are around you. So after you keep your mouth shut, well, what happens then? Where does it go when your mouth is quiet? Where do those thoughts go? They go in here, right? And then you're like, and you're chewing up thing over there. So that's the second thing to aim when you catch yourself doing that. He says, how do you stop yourself from chewing on those bad thoughts that you wanted to say, but you decided not to say. Forgiveness is one way of doing it, yes. Excuse me? Accept it. Accept. But that's kind of like almost like a resignation, right? It's like, yeah, okay, I just got to accept it. How do you turn it into something positive?
Awareness. We need to be aware that it's occurring, and in the awareness, notice where we place our choice.
Awareness is very important, but we have to take something that's either negative or indifferent, like just, okay. We have to take something there, we have to turn it to something positive. Because, what was that?
A lesson?
You pray.
Pray. From the bad
Pray.
situation that you are. I think you said already prayer, because John Genesis says instead you try to confront the problem itself, try to deviate to another positive aspect. So you're praying, you're giving the opportunity to listen to God and then see in a different perspective.
But what if you're so upset that you can't even pray? What if you're so caught up, this is such a upsetting thing to you, you haven't said anything and the things are still rolling around in your head. How do you turn it into something positive, something that you want to happen?
You look for the gift that's in it. You know that there's going to be a strength that comes from this expiation. There's going to be, I'm going to be stronger and I'm going to have more patience.
Right.
Right. I'm going to have more space to see myself in relationship to my desire around, outside of the emotion.
But, and then the next step after that would actually be to prefer it, wouldn't it? I mean, this is what Francis did. He actually wanted to, just in the same way that he wanted to go talk to the wolf, he was happy to go talk to the wolf. He says these trials, we should be happy for them because they are pushing us past our ego, past our own personality, past all the things that's going to fall away. If we wanted to save our soul, we're not looking to retreat to find out where we're going to have a little safe corner where we can, you know, just live out to the end of our days. He's talking about pushing yourself past your own comfort. And he says it's only at that point, by being poor, by forgiving your enemies, by forgiving, in any case, and being a peacemaker, that you can start to think about, you can actually prefer these things. It's kind of a funny thing, right? This is not an easy thing for us to accept at all, because we still want ours. But once you start to reflect on this, you start to realize it's me-centered. It's a me-centered life at that point. It's like what I want. It's the way I want life to be. And he says we got to push ourselves past that point. Well, it's 7:30, and I thank you so much for working this out with me. I learned some things too. I hope you did. And Francis is, I mean, what can you say? He's someone, he revived Jesus' messages. And he's kind of made it, in a way, it's almost as obscure as Jesus in that way. Maybe obscure is not the right word, but it's, you know, in the same way that Jesus is asking you to have faith in the things that he's saying, to follow him. There's so many stories in Francis that allow you to reflect that life of Jesus, because that's really what Francis wanted to do. He wanted to take every one of those teachings of Jesus and turn them into his own life and find out where it would lead him. So I hope you continue, and I know I will continue to learn about St. Francis, and I thank you.